Washington's attempts to overthrow Syrian President Bashar Assad have taken a new turn. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is now calling for a major reshaping of the rebel leadership. America has grown disillusioned with Syria's main opposition alliance, the foreign-based National Council, for failing to gain support from other groups. Clinton claims the leadership should represent those actually fighting on the front line. The Syrian opposition consists of various rebel militias, many of which have reportedly been infiltrated by radical Islamists linked to al-Qaeda. For more, let's go to London and Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First magazine. Thank you so much, Marcus, for joining our team. Now, the U.S. says it doesn't need the Syrian National Council after almost 2 years of actually treating these people as the main opposition voice. What's behind this sudden change of tactic?
I think it's plausible to argue that it's dawned on certain policymakers within the State Department in Washington that trying to overthrow the legitimate government of President Bashar al-Assad via the Syrian National Council hasn't worked and isn't going to work, and therefore the American State Department are probably looking at a more direct approach now to removing President Assad. Now, when I say a direct approach, that doesn't necessarily mean NATO intervention. I happen to believe that there won't be NATO intervention because Syria is not Libya, it's not Serbia, it has so many different tentacles in so many different parts of the Middle East that NATO intervention could make it catastrophic. And also, we mustn't forget a major factor is that Russia has a naval base in Syria at the port of Tartus. So if there was NATO intervention and a NATO, say, cruise missile was to accidentally strike that base and kill a Russian serviceman, what then? But I think that what we're possibly looking at, given Hillary Clinton's remarks yesterday, was a more direct approach, a more direct help to the Syrian militants, which of course poses a whole array of very, very serious problems.
Now, Hillary Clinton said extremists should not hijack the Syrian revolution. How much weight is there to these words when Washington is now turning directly to the rebels on the ground, many of which are reportedly linked to al-Qaeda?
Let's be clear about it. The American stance on the situation in Syria is not new. We can take it back to Afghanistan in the 1980s, when what we saw then, as we're seeing today, is short-term, reckless foreign policy objectives, which only puts ordinary civilians on the streets of New York and London at risk. By getting into bed with Islamic extremists in Syria, it's only going to strengthen them in the Middle East, but it will also only strengthen international terrorism. And of course, the irony is that there is a very serious threat from Islamic extremism in the world, but that threat, on the one hand, is being fought by the Americans in Afghanistan at present, but at the same time, is being strengthened by assistance that's been given to them. And let's not forget, what we're seeing in Syria didn't actually start with Iraq. It started with Afghanistan in the 1980s, when we were told in the West that the Mujahideen, including Osama bin Laden, were freedom fighters. And the American, British and French governments, they trained them, they provided them with equipment and cash. And look what happened on 9/11. So it's there's certainly no weight behind Hillary Clinton's argument. However, I do very much suspect that direct help will be given to the militants on the ground, regardless of the fact that many of them are affiliated to al-Qaeda or other Islamic extremist groups, simply because in the short term it suits American foreign policy to try and remove President Assad.
Marcus, Syrian rebels say they had begun arming sympathetic Palestinian refugees to fight pro-Assad forces in Damascus. With the rebels splitting up Syrian society, how long do you think before we see a full-blown sectarian war?
Well, I think at the moment, we could already be seeing a sectarian war taking place in Syria. But the policy now of the militants in Syria to try and bring the Palestinians who live in Syria into the fray is absolutely deplorable. But there is another side to it. On the one hand, it shows the murderous, destructive attitude of the Syrian militants. But on the other hand, regrettably, it does show how the Palestinians are used as a pawn by many groups and, of course, by many Arab governments across the region. We have to be very clear-cut. The Palestinians have a legitimate cause, as do the Israelis have a legitimate cause. But But in regard to the Palestinians, numerous Arab governments, they use the Palestinians as pawns to try and deflect problems at home in their own countries as a rallying point behind their own governments by having Israel as an enemy. So on the one hand, as I said, it shows exactly the sort of people the Syrian militants are by attempting to increase the appalling bloodshed in Syria at the moment. But also on the other hand, it just shows how the Palestinians are, quite frankly, used and abused.
All right, joining me there from London, Marcus Papadopoulos, editor of Politics First magazine. Thank you.
Thank you.